In the 1970s, America was a nation in transition. The innocence of the post-war era had given way to social upheaval, and yet, for many young people, college campuses still represented hope and opportunity. Young women across the Pacific Northwest pursued their dreams, unaware that a predator walked among them, a man who would redefine the public's understanding of evil. His name was Theodore Robert Bundy. To his friends and acquaintances, he was Ted, charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious. A psychology student who volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline. A young Republican who worked on political campaigns. A law student with a bright future ahead of him. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy brutally murdered at least 30 young women across 7 states, though many investigators believe the actual number could be much higher. His crimes shocked the nation, not just for their brutality, but for the chilling realization that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like the boy next door. This is the story of Ted Bundy, not to glorify his actions, but to understand how one man could fool so many for so long, and to remember the victims whose lives were stolen far too soon. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His birth certificate listed his father as unknown, though later evidence suggested it may have been his own grandfather. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was just 22 years old and unmarried, a significant stigma in 1940s America. For the first 3 years of his life, young Ted lived with his grandparents in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was told that his mother was actually his sister, and his grandparents were his parents, a deception meant to shield the family from shame. This early environment would prove foundational to his psychological development. Ted's grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was by multiple accounts a violent and abusive man with a terrible temper. He was known to beat animals and push people down stairs. The household was filled with tension, rage, and fear. Ted's grandmother suffered from depression and received electroshock therapy. Some family members later recalled disturbing incidents, including a young Ted placing kitchen knives around his sleeping aunt when he was just 3 years old. In 1950, Eleanor moved with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, to live with relatives. She wanted a fresh start, away from her father's tyrannical control. A year later, she met and married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a military cook and hospital cook, who adopted Ted and gave him his surname. The family grew quickly, with 4 more children born in subsequent years. By all outward appearances, Ted had a normal childhood in Tacoma. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and performed reasonably well in school. But beneath the surface, something was fundamentally wrong. Ted later described feeling different from other children, disconnected and unable to understand social cues that came naturally to others. As a teenager, Ted began exhibiting troubling behaviors. He became a habitual shoplifter and petty thief. He peered into windows at night, watching women undress. And crucially, he developed an early fascination with violent pornography and detective magazines that featured stories about sexual violence against women. Yet to his teachers, neighbors, and family, Ted seemed like a nice, quiet boy. He was clean-cut, polite, and moderately popular. He graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in 1965 and enrolled at the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington in 1966 to study Chinese. It was during this period that Ted's double life truly began to take shape, the charming, ambitious student on the outside, and something much darker growing within. In 1967, Ted Bundy met the woman who would become both his obsession and, according to many criminologists, the template for his future victims. Her name was Stephanie Brooks, a beautiful, sophisticated young woman from a wealthy California family. She was everything Ted wasn't, confident, refined, and from the upper class he desperately wanted to join. Ted fell deeply in love with Stephanie. She represented the life he craved: status, respectability, success. For a time, they dated seriously. But Stephanie ultimately saw through Ted's facade. She viewed him as immature, directionless, and lacking ambition. In 1968, she broke up with him, leaving Ted devastated and humiliated. The rejection cut to his core. 4 years afterward, Stephanie would remain his ideal, the one who got away, the woman who rejected him. And hauntingly, nearly all of Ted Bundy's known victims would bear a striking resemblance to Stephanie Brooks, young, attractive women with long dark hair parted in the middle. After the breakup, Ted spiraled. He dropped out of the University of Washington and drifted through various jobs. But by 1969, something changed. Ted decided to reinvent himself. He re-enrolled at the University of Washington, this time studying psychology. He threw himself into his studies with newfound intensity and earned excellent grades. He also became politically active in the Republican Party, working on local campaigns and impressing party officials with his intelligence and dedication. He volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline, where his supervisor praised his empathy and ability to connect with callers. He even saved a drowning child at one point, earning recognition as a hero. By all appearances, Ted Bundy was becoming the man he'd always wanted to be. In 1969, he met Elizabeth Klopfer, a divorced secretary with a young daughter. They began a relationship that would last 6 years. Elizabeth, who later wrote a memoir about her time with Ted, described him as loving, attentive, and good with her daughter. In 1973, Ted enrolled in law school at the University of Puget Sound. He also reconnected with Stephanie Brooks, who was impressed by his transformation. They began dating again, and this time, Ted seemed to have the upper hand. But in January 1974, without explanation, Ted abruptly ended the relationship. When Stephanie called him, confused and hurt, Ted coldly replied, "I have no idea what you're talking about." It was the ultimate revenge, making Stephanie feel the rejection and humiliation he'd experienced years before. Many psychologists believe this was a pivotal moment. Having achieved his revenge, having proven he could become whoever he wanted to be, Ted Bundy no longer needed the mask he'd so carefully constructed. Just weeks later, the murders began. On the night of January 4, 1974, a young woman named Joni Lenz, a dancer and student at the University of Washington, was asleep in her basement bedroom in Seattle. An intruder entered through an unlocked door, approached her bed, and brutally beat her with a metal rod from her bed frame. He then sexually assaulted her with the same rod before vanishing into the night. Joni survived but suffered permanent brain damage and had no memory of the attack. She was the lucky one. On February 1, 1974, Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old psychology major at the University of Washington, disappeared from her basement bedroom. Her bed was made, and there was blood on her pillow and nightgown, but Linda was gone. Her housemates initially thought she'd simply left early, but Linda never returned. She was Ted Bundy's first confirmed murder victim. Then, in rapid succession, more young women began to disappear across Washington and Oregon. The pattern was chilling. Attractive, college-aged women with long dark hair parted in the middle. All vanished without a trace. March 12, Donna Gail Manson, 19, disappeared from Evergreen State College in Olympia. April 17, Susan Rancourt, 18, vanished from Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, disappeared from Oregon State University in Corvallis. June 1, Brenda Carroll Ball, 22, vanished after leaving a tavern in Burien, Washington. June 11, Georgianne Hawkins, 18, disappeared from an alley behind her residence at the University of Washington. Multiple witnesses heard screams, but by the time anyone investigated, she was gone. The Pacific Northwest was gripped by fear. Parents warned their daughters. Women began walking in groups. Campus police increased patrols. But the disappearances continued. Then came July 14, 1974, the day that would eventually crack the case wide open. At Lake Sammamish State Park, a crowded beach area east of Seattle, multiple witnesses reported seeing a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, approaching young women and asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. He introduced himself as Ted. That day, two women, Janice Ott, 23, and Denise Naslund, 19, separately agreed to help the friendly stranger. Neither was ever seen alive again. Their remains were found 2 months later, along with the skeletal remains of another unidentified young woman, in a wooded area near the park. The Lake Sammamish abductions marked a turning point. For the first time, multiple witnesses had seen the killer. Police released composite sketches of a handsome man named Ted, who drove a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. The sketches looked eerily like Ted Bundy. And several people, including Elizabeth Klopfer, his girlfriend, called the police tip line to report their suspicions. But Ted Bundy seemed so normal, so respectable. He was a law student, a former crisis hotline volunteer, a political campaign worker. Surely, the investigators thought, he couldn't be the killer. They were tragically wrong. By the fall of 1974, Ted Bundy had already murdered at least 8 women in Washington and Oregon. But he was just getting started. And now, sensing that investigators might be closing in, he was about to take his terror to a new state. In September 1974, Ted Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah. To anyone who knew him, it seemed like a natural progression, a bright young man advancing his legal education. But for Ted Bundy, Utah represented something else entirely, fresh hunting grounds where no one knew his face or his name. On October 2, 1974, just weeks after arriving in Utah, Bundy struck again. 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared after leaving an all-night party in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Her body was never found. 16 days later, on October 18, Melissa Smith, 17, the daughter of a local police chief, vanished after leaving a pizza restaurant in Midvale, Utah. Her body was found 9 days later in a mountainous area. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled. The pace of killing accelerated. October 31, Laura M., 17, disappeared from Lehi, Utah. Her body was found weeks later in the Wasatch Mountains. November 8, Carol Duranch, 18, became one of the few women to escape Ted Bundy's clutches. In a shopping mall in Murray, Utah, a well-dressed man claiming to be a police officer approached her. He said her car had been broken into and asked her to accompany him to the police station. Carol, trusting the professional-seeming man, got into his car. But instead of heading to a police station, the man drove to a remote area and attempted to handcuff her. When Carol fought back, he tried to strike her with a crowbar. In the struggle, she managed to escape and flag down a passing car. She gave police a detailed description of her attacker and his car, a tan Volkswagen Beetle. That same evening, just hours after Carol's escape, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared from a high school play in Bountiful, Utah. She was never seen again. Ted Bundy had now expanded his killing territory into Colorado as well. On January 12, 1975, Karen Campbell, 23, vanished from a ski resort in Snowmass, Colorado. Her body was found a month later. She had been killed by blows to her head. Throughout the spring and summer of 1975, more women disappeared and were murdered in Colorado: Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Lynette Culver, and Susan Curtis. Each disappeared without a trace. Each left behind devastated families and communities living in fear. But Ted Bundy was growing increasingly confident, perhaps even reckless. He was attending law school during the day and hunting at night. His grades began to slip. He stole items he didn't need. And critically, he was becoming careless. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer noticed a Volkswagen Beetle weaving through traffic in a residential area at 2:30 in the morning. When the officer tried to pull the car over, it sped away. After a brief chase, the driver finally stopped. The driver was Ted Bundy. In his car, police found handcuffs, a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, trash bags, rope, and other suspicious items. Bundy claimed he'd been smoking marijuana and panicked when he saw the police car. He was arrested for evading a police officer and possession of burglary tools. But the detective who processed his arrest recognized Bundy's car from bulletins about the attempted abduction of Carol Duranch. The composite sketches also matched. For the first time, Ted Bundy was facing serious scrutiny. But even now, with the evidence mounting, no one could quite believe that this charming, articulate law student could be the monster they were searching for. On October 2, 1975, Ted Bundy was placed in a police lineup. Carol Duranch, the young woman who had escaped his attempted abduction almost a year earlier, immediately identified him as her attacker. It was the break investigators needed. Bundy was charged with attempted kidnapping and released on bail. While free, he continued attending law school and maintaining his innocence, but police were now building cases against him for multiple murders. On February 23, 1976, his trial for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch began. Ted Bundy chose to represent himself, cross-examining witnesses and presenting arguments with surprising legal acumen. He was articulate, composed, and even charming. But the evidence was overwhelming. Carol Duranche's testimony was powerful and credible. Physical evidence, including hair samples found in Bundy's car that matched Carol's, further sealed his fate. On March 1, 1976, Ted Bundy was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But the legal system wasn't done with him. Colorado authorities now wanted him for the murder of Karen Campbell at the Snowmass ski resort. In January 1977, Bundy was extradited to Colorado to stand trial for murder. He was held in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs. Despite being a murder suspect, Bundy was allowed certain privileges due to his status as his own attorney, including access to the law library without handcuffs or leg shackles. On June 7, 1977, during a court hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Ted Bundy made his first escape. While in the law library on the second floor, he jumped from a window and ran. He was free for 6 days before being recaptured, hungry and exhausted, driving a stolen car. Bundy's escape made national headlines and turned him into a bizarre sort of celebrity. Some people actually began to romanticize him, the good-looking, intelligent defendant who dared to leap to freedom. It was a dangerous mythology that minimized the horror of his crimes. Bundy was moved to a more secure facility in Glenwood Springs, but his desire for freedom hadn't diminished. Over the following months, he lost significant weight, about 35 pounds, fitting through small spaces in his cell. On December 30, 1977, while guards were distracted during the holidays, Bundy escaped again. This time, he sawed through the bars of his cell, squeezed through the opening, broke through the ceiling into the apartment above, which belonged to the jailer, changed into civilian clothes he found there, and walked out the front door. By the time authorities realized he was gone, Ted Bundy had a massive head start. He stole a car, drove to Denver, and then caught a flight to Chicago. From there, he traveled to Michigan and then, on January 8, 1978, arrived in Tallahassee, Florida. Ted Bundy was free again. And he was about to commit his most horrific crimes yet. In January 1978, Ted Bundy rented a room near Florida State University in Tallahassee under the alias Chris Hagen. He stole food, credit cards, and cars to survive. He attended classes at the university, blending in with students despite being a wanted fugitive. For a few weeks, he lived in relative obscurity. But Ted Bundy couldn't stop. His compulsion to kill was too powerful. In the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through a rear door that had been left unlocked. Over the course of approximately 15 minutes, he went from room to room in a frenzied, brutal attack that would shock even seasoned homicide investigators. In one room, he attacked Margaret Bowman, 21, beating her with a piece of firewood and strangling her to death. In another room, he attacked Lisa Levy, 20, beating, strangling, and sexually assaulting her. Both young women died in their beds. In 2 other rooms, Bundy attacked Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, who both survived despite suffering severe injuries, including fractured skulls and broken jaws. Their desperate screams finally alerted other residents. Just blocks away, minutes after fleeing the Chi Omega house, Bundy broke into another apartment and attacked Cheryl Thomas, a dance student, beating her so severely that she suffered permanent hearing loss and equilibrium damage. Somehow, she survived. The Chi Omega murders horrified the nation. 4 young women attacked in their own home in the span of minutes. 2 dead. 2 barely alive. The violence was unprecedented and seemed to lack any clear motive beyond pure evil. Police had few leads initially, but they did have something crucial, a bite mark on Lisa Levy's body. It would prove to be the physical evidence that would ultimately help convict Ted Bundy. Just 3 weeks after the Chi Omega attacks, on February 9, 1978, Bundy struck again. He abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her middle school in Lake City, Florida. Her body was found 8 weeks later in a state park. She had been raped and murdered. Kimberly Leach would be Ted Bundy's final victim. On February 15, 1978, a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, noticed a Volkswagen Beetle being driven erratically. When he ran the license plates, they came back as stolen. He pulled the car over and asked the driver for identification. The man gave the name Kenneth Meisner and seemed nervous. When the officer asked him to step out of the vehicle, the man suddenly attacked, trying to escape. After a brief struggle, The officer subdued and handcuffed him. Only later, after running his fingerprints, did authorities realize who they had: Ted Bundy, one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Ted Bundy's reign of terror was finally over. Ted Bundy's trials became a media sensation unlike anything America had seen before. For the first time in history, court proceedings were broadcast live on television, and millions of Americans tuned in to watch the handsome, articulate defendant represent himself in a murder trial. The first trial for the Chi Omega murders began on June 25, 1979, in Miami. Bundy once again chose to act as his own attorney, with court-appointed lawyers assisting him. He seemed to relish the spotlight, frequently turning to wave at cameras and smile at spectators. Some observers were disturbingly charmed by him. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They presented eyewitness testimony from Chi Omega residents who saw a man fleeing the house, physical evidence linking Bundy to the crime scene, testimony from Carol Duranch about her escape in Utah, establishing a pattern of behavior, expert testimony about pantyhose found in Bundy's possession that matched pantyhose used as a murder weapon, and crucially, forensic odontology, bite mark evidence. The bite mark on Lisa Levy's body was compared with dental impressions taken from Bundy. 3 forensic dentists testified that the bite mark matched Bundy's teeth with reasonable medical certainty. It was revolutionary evidence at the time and formed a key part of the prosecution's case. Bundy's defense was weak. He presented no alibi and called no witnesses who could place him elsewhere during the attacks. His cross-examinations were aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. His charm couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence against him. On July 24, 1979, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and 3 counts of attempted murder for the attacks on Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas. During the penalty phase, Bundy made a shocking decision. He proposed to his girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, while she was testifying as a character witness. Under an obscure Florida law, their declaration in court before a judge constituted a legal marriage. It was a bizarre spectacle that further demonstrated Bundy's narcissism and desire for control, even in the face of death. On July 31, 1979, Judge Edward Cowart sentenced Ted Bundy to death by electrocution. But the judge's words to Bundy would become infamous: "Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. It's a tragedy to this court to see such a total waste of humanity. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner." Even the judge seemed unable to fully reconcile the intelligent, articulate man before him with the monster he had become. In January 1980, Bundy stood trial again, this time for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitnesses had seen him with Kimberly, fibers from his clothing matched fibers found on her body, and semen evidence linked him to the crime. On February 7, 1980, Bundy was convicted of first-degree murder and received a 3rd death sentence. Ted Bundy would spend the next 9 years on death row, continuing to proclaim his innocence, granting interviews, and manipulating anyone who would listen. He became a celebrity, receiving fan mail from women who were disturbingly attracted to him. Some refused to believe he could be guilty. But behind closed doors, away from the cameras and admirers, Ted Bundy was a cold, calculating killer who had destroyed countless lives. And as his execution date approached, he would finally begin to reveal the true scope of his crimes. For nearly a decade, Ted Bundy sat on death row in Florida State Prison, exhausting every possible appeal. He granted numerous interviews to journalists, psychologists, and authors, always controlling the narrative, never fully admitting his guilt. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, of pornography, of society itself, anything but taking responsibility for his actions. But by late 1988, his appeals were running out. His execution date was set for January 24, 1989. Facing his mortality, Ted Bundy finally decided to talk, not out of remorse, but as a final manipulation, a last bid to extend his life by offering information about unsolved murders. In the days before his execution, Bundy met with investigators and confessed to 30 murders across 7 states between 1974 and 1978. He provided details about victims, locations, and methods. But many investigators believed the true number was much higher, possibly more than 100 victims. Bundy described his modus operandi. He would often feign injury, wearing a cast or sling, to appear vulnerable and trustworthy. He would approach young women in public places, asking for help. Once he had them near his Volkswagen Beetle, he would overpower them. He admitted to decapitating at least 12 victims and keeping their severed heads as trophies in his apartment. He returned to crime scenes to perform sexual acts with decomposing bodies. He applied makeup to the corpses and shampooed their hair. The depravity was almost incomprehensible. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who interviewed Bundy, later said he showed no genuine remorse. His confessions were given clinically, without emotion, as if he were describing someone else's actions. Even at the end, Ted Bundy was incapable of true empathy or understanding the magnitude of his crimes. On January 23, 1989, the day before his execution, Bundy gave his final interview to Dr. James Dobson, a psychologist. In it, Bundy blamed his actions on his early exposure to violent pornography, a claim most experts viewed as yet another manipulation, an attempt to shift blame away from himself. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Some held signs that read "Burn, Bundy, burn," and cheered when his death was announced. It was a dark moment in American history, celebrating an execution, even of a serial killer. Ted Bundy's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, the same area where he had dumped the bodies of some of his victims. It was a final ghoulish connection to the crimes that had defined his life. The story of Ted Bundy is not just the story of one man's evil. It is the story of at least 30 young women whose lives were stolen, whose families were shattered, and whose potential was never realized. It is crucial that we remember them, not just as victims, but as individuals with dreams, hopes, and futures. Among the confirmed victims: Linda and Healy, a psychology student who hoped to work with skiers; Margaret Bowman, who loved animals and wanted to be a teacher; Lisa Levy, who dreamed of a career in fashion merchandising; Kimberly Leach, just 12 years old, who never had the chance to grow up. And so many others: Donna, Susan, Roberta, Brenda, Georgianne, Janice, Denise, Nancy, Melissa, Laura, Karen, Julie, Denise, Lynette, and Susan. These women were daughters, sisters, friends. They had families who loved them and lives ahead of them. Ted Bundy took all of that away. The Bundy case fundamentally changed how law enforcement investigates serial murder. It led to the development of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which created offender profiling techniques still used today. It demonstrated the importance of multi-jurisdictional cooperation in tracking mobile offenders. And it shattered the myth that serial killers always look like monsters. Sometimes they look disturbingly normal. The case also revealed dangerous truths about society's response to violent criminals. Ted Bundy received fan mail from women who found him attractive, even after his convictions. He was treated like a celebrity, with people seeking his autograph. This disturbing phenomenon, sometimes called hybristophilia, or attraction to criminals, highlights how superficial charm can blind people to evil. Experts who studied Bundy's case identified him as a classic psychopath, someone with superficial charm, above-average intelligence, lack of remorse or guilt, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and a grandiose sense of self. His crimes weren't crimes of passion or circumstances. They were the calculated actions of someone who viewed other human beings as objects for his gratification. Perhaps most chillingly, Ted Bundy once said in an interview, "I'm the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet." It may have been the only completely honest thing he ever said. Today, advances in DNA technology, fingerprint analysis, and forensic science have made it much harder for serial killers to operate undetected for as long as Bundy did. Multi-state databases, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, and public awareness campaigns have all contributed to faster identification and capture of violent offenders. But the lessons of the Ted Bundy case remain relevant. We must remain vigilant. We must trust our instincts. And we must never assume that evil comes in an easily recognizable package. Ted Bundy's legacy is one of horror and heartbreak. But it is also a legacy of lessons learned, systems improved, and a collective determination to prevent such tragedies in the future. The victims of Ted Bundy cannot be brought back, but their memories can serve as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of justice. In remembering Ted Bundy, we must focus not on the killer, but on those whose lives he stole. They deserve to be remembered not as victims of Ted Bundy, but as individuals who mattered, who were loved, and whose absence left irreparable holes in the lives of those who knew them. May they rest in peace. And may we never forget. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and share for more incredible documentary stories.